This unit, we're going to learn all about what the world was like from the 1300s to the 1600s. It's a time period where there's massive change in Europe and lots of things to learn. Here we see a map of all the empires that were solidly in place by the year 1500 all across the world. Some of them will probably sound kind of familiar to you. You're going to see these again on a test, so make sure that you pay attention to them. The Aztec, Mayan, and Incans are probably the ones that are most familiar to you because they occurred on our side of the planet. Songhai, of course, was in Africa. The Ottoman Empire is now modern-day Turkey. Persia is now modern-day Iraq. And the Mughal Empire took up most of India at one time. And then, of course, you have China and Japan. So some of these we're going to look at really closely in this unit, and some of them we'll just kind of brush on. Let's look at some of the trade routes by 1500. Trade routes, of course, are roads or paths across water that are well established. In several countries, many countries in fact, had lots of established trade routes by the year 1500, and they had a pretty clear market of what their goods were, and they tried not to interfere with each other, so it kind of, keep the peace among people. So China was most famous for silk. That was the #1 moneymaker for China. They also had porcelain that they carried along their trade routes, and they are the first ones ever to develop the compass, which by the year 1500 you're going to have people exploring, so the compass is going to be a pretty important part of a lot of people's lives. But the most important thing that China probably gave to the world is paper. Paper of any kind that you can think of. They were the first ones to use toilet paper. They were the first ones with wallpaper, actual paper to write on, paper money, anything that you can think of. Even the umbrella, which at one time was just to protect people from the sun, that was made of paper originally. So China gave us lots and lots and lots of things, but paper, silk, porcelain, and compass are the main four. India and the Middle East gave us things like the numerical system. They gave us the number 0 and the numbers 1 through 10 as well. And textiles. Think about all the beautiful gowns and jeweled gowns especially that come out of India. These people had beautiful, beautiful textiles, and they sold them all across the world. So there's other ideas that we can't really pinpoint coming out of any one country, but they traveled along these paths too, and they include things like medicine, astronomy knowledge, different mathematics other than just the 0 through 10, and they came from all over the place, like I said before. So let's look at the Middle Ages so that we can kind of compare the Middle Ages to the years after that. The Middle Ages are sometimes called the Dark Ages, also called the medieval period. So there's lots of changes going on as they come out of the Middle Ages, but I want to take you to the right smack in the middle of the Middle Ages to kind of give you a picture of what life was like for these people. The government really was the church. The church was in charge of everything and had all-powerful knowledge according to the thoughts of the common people. They thought the church was just wise beyond belief and knew how to take care of people, even though they were doing some pretty cruddy things. So the government was pretty much the church. Society itself lived in fear of the church, and the monarchs, most often in Europe, were pretty controlling as well. And the common people lived every day not knowing if their belongings would be removed from them, if taxes would be to the limit that they could no longer pay and their family was going to starve to death. It was just not a very good time for people in the Middle Ages. And you didn't have a lot of new ideas. One of the reasons was because the church was very stoic and very particular about what they wanted common citizens to know, and you had to run everything through the church before you were allowed to make it public. So society was very stifled. It's not that creativity died, it was just stifled by the church. Health and hygiene was very bad as well. At this time period, you also have the bubonic plague moving through Europe, and England in particular was hit very, very hard by the bubonic plague, so much so that they ran out of land to bury people, and they started renting out lots of land. So you rented it for a small time period, three days to a week was most often the time limit that you were allowed to rent, and that was supposed to be the time for your family to come to the graveyard and grieve and say their goodbyes and feel a sense of closure. And then after your leased time period was over, they dug you back up and they threw you into the boneyard. It was a giant pile filled with other bones. And once the pile got too full, they just incinerated all of it so that they could fit more on top of it. So not a very good time period at all. Home life usually consisted of 2 rooms. Remember that they don't have electricity or anything, so it's all candlelight. They live in darkness. There's not a lot of things going on after dark, and it's very cramped and not much privacy at all. And basically the only thing that they had that they could drink that wasn't contaminated was beer, because beer is distilled and it removes a lot of the poisons. Their water was stagnant because there was so much disease and so much just misunderstanding about hygiene. Of course, people didn't bathe, they didn't brush their teeth, they urinated wherever they felt like it, and for a while water was actually considered deadly. You drank it, you were taking your life into your hands. So not a very good home life. A bunch of drunk, smelly people. Not a good way to live. Art was stifled as well, any kind of art that you can think of. And again, it had to go through the church before it was allowed to be publicized. And the church was adamant that everything be focused on the church. So that stifled creativity and kept people from really using their imaginations in the way that they wanted to sometimes. They also were still practicing something called feudalism. And under feudalism, basically the peasants are at the bottom of this hierarchy in society, and everything is controlled by the church and the kings and the nobles. And the peasants are very often mistreated or left to die on their own because they had no land to live on and no one was willing to take them in. So feudalism was not really a good idea in the Middle Ages, but it was the way of the world, and people did it for protection. You had to live in a group secluded from everybody else, and that's kind of what feudalism did. It separated everybody into these little homesteads, and if you were a peasant living on a feudal lot, you had to pay homage to whoever it was that owned that land and do whatever they said and grow crops for them. And it was sort of like indentured servitude or even sharecropping. You can compare it to that. So feudalism, not a good way to live either. So with all of that in mind, let's now look at the Renaissance and the Reformation. This is a time period where people are coming out of those Middle Ages, those Dark Ages, the medieval period, and they want change. So the Middle Ages officially ends in the year 1500. So when I say Renaissance and Reformation 1300 to 1600, it's because it doesn't just happen overnight. By 1300, there were people in places all over Europe saying, we want change, we want a better life. So the years aren't quite going to match up. Some of you might remember from World War I that the Renaissance actually means rebirth, the word Renaissance, and it is literally a rebirth of art and of learning. Historians consider this to be the birth of our modern world, and it began in northern Italy, and then it ended up spreading to the rest of Europe from there, but it starts in Italy, and it led to accomplishments in visual arts, literature, intellectual ideas, anything and change that you can think of. When we look at Renaissance art, the thing we look at most often is actual physical artwork like portraits. So I want to give you a really good comparison here of the medieval versus the Renaissance art. So the medieval you can see on the left, very flat, almost cartoonish. The features of the human are not accurate, and that's done on purpose because the churches believe that if you show the accuracy of the human forms in the picture, that it would take away from the religious tones in the picture, and religion should be more important than the people. So the people are purposely done kind of cartoonyish. But here on the right hand side you can see it's actually a sketch pad from Michelangelo, and it's done during the Renaissance period, and you can see where he's perfecting how to do a human being's foot. So he's done the toes, more than one toe, and then he's done the foot itself, and you can see all the ripples in the man's body, so it's more true to life. It's 3D very realistic, actually looks like a human being. So it's very easy to tell if a painting was done in medieval period or if it was done in the Renaissance period. So let's look at another example of Renaissance art. Michelangelo is probably the most famous, or at least one of the most famous artists during the Renaissance time. And he, of course, did the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which is absolutely beautiful. And the ceiling has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small scenes like the one you see in front of you. But this one is probably the most famous. It's called The Creation of Adam. And it's supposed to be that moment right as God is about to touch Adam and breathe a soul into him. So Adam is alive but soulless until God touches him. And this is the beginning of humanity. So it's the most famous picture that Michelangelo ever did. Now, Michelangelo also did the Pieta, which is my most favorite piece of work. The Pieta is a extreme in opposites for Michelangelo, and he did this on purpose. Michelangelo wanted to show Mary, the mother, of course, who is holding Jesus, heavily clothed. So it would be a heavily clothed individual versus a barely clad individual, Jesus. He wanted a man versus a woman. He wanted her bigger in life and Jesus smaller in death. So all these things were opposites of each other. One of the really unique things about this is Michelangelo did not have tons of patience for religion or religious leaders, I should say, of the time. He himself was actually a very religious man, but he kind of thought that church figures were silly and had too much power. You know, he saw them as men, not these almost gods like the other people did. And Michelangelo did not have a lot of patience or respect for leaders of the church, but he definitely had a very deep love for Jesus and for Mary. And Mary, he said he wanted to show the world a different side to her. People, according to Michelangelo, kind of forgot what she gave the world. So here in this statue, the Pieta, he wanted her to be bigger than Jesus, not just to have opposites here, but to show the world that this is a mother holding her dead child. And to make her bigger than Jesus kind of brought that thought home that Mary was actually holding her child and loving her child, because we forget that she was the mother that gave the ultimate sacrifice and willingly gave up her son for others. And he felt that it was a shame that people didn't remember that. So a great man, very sarcastic sometimes, but a great man with a beautiful vision. We also need to talk about Leonardo da Vinci, who of course created the Mona Lisa. And this is supposed to be a painting that is mathematically perfect. So I can't explain that to you because I'm not good at math, but supposedly everything on her is mathematically perfect, and the background is mathematically perfect. That's all I can tell you, because again, I'm not a math person, so I'm just going to believe what other people have said. So some people say that the Mona Lisa is actually Da Vinci in disguise, that he painted a portrait of himself, and this is one of the half of it is the Mona Lisa and half of it is a self-portrait he did of himself. And this is the most accepted theory, that that's maybe who she was, but I don't know. You make up your own mind, decide what you think. Da Vinci, of course, also did The Last Supper. And The Last Supper is a new technique in art, and the artist created the picture in such a way that the person viewing it could be forced to look at a certain part of the picture. And it was the artist's choice where they would look. Nobody had ever tried this before. So Leonardo da Vinci attempted this and did a great job of it. Jesus is sitting in the middle, so you automatically want to go to the middle anyway, because that's just how our brains work. But he's also the only figure that is alone and fully outlined by one of the windows. So you can see that off on the left-hand side, the figure sitting in front of that window isn't fully in the window. And then on the right-hand side, you have several figures there. So he's alone. He stands out. Again, you're going to look at him. And then the final thing that he added to it is that most of the people in the picture, actually all the people in the picture, are in some way, somehow, either looking or pointing at Jesus. And when you first walk up to the picture, your mind doesn't really think that, but in the back of your mind, in your subconscious, that part of your mind is picking that up. And because everything in the picture points towards Jesus, your eyes are drawn towards Jesus because he's being pointed at. So it was a architectural genius kind of move here, and he was the first one to ever do it. And now that's a pretty famous thing for artists to do that. They do it quite often, and advertisers do that in their ads to make us look where they want in a certain order to trick us. So it's a technique that's still used today. So literature of the Renaissance was unique because it focused on human concerns. That was a really big thing. Up until this point, it was all about the church and God and what could you do to be holy, not human concerns like love or jealousy or anything like that. It was all about the church. So suddenly it's all about human concerns. And writings of this period often portrayed a mortal, ordinary man pitted against something supernatural or against an authority figure. That was not accepted during the medieval period because the church would have thought, you know, that's making people think thoughts that they shouldn't think, and they might eventually turn against us. So that was kind of forbidden. The most famous writer of the time, I'm sure you've heard of, is William Shakespeare, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him. Here's some of the words or phrases that William Shakespeare has come up with or came up with in his work. I could give you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, but these ones that you see in front of you on the screen are ones he actually made up. There's tons more, like make ends meet. There's tons and tons and tons of them, but I just wanted you to be able to see that he still does affect people today, because so many of the sayings that he used in his plays we still use. It's part of our common language now. All right, let's look at the type of writing that was done in the time that was brand new. Other than the ghost and the authority figure, there was this new type of writing called humanism, and humanism focuses on human potential, like what we're capable of, and it kind of uplifts us. You know, what are our achievements? That definitely was not allowed in the medieval period because it wasn't about us. It was supposed to all be about God. So Europeans became more secular. In other words, they were concerned with worldly matters rather than heavenly matters. You know, why is it that this man is a great writer and that man is not a great writer? Why doesn't that woman love me? Things like that. Things nobody had ever been allowed to ask before. So a really important individual in the intellectual idea of humanism was a man by the name of Erasmus. If you took History 101, then you know that Erasmus was one of two men who are considered the father of humanism. But we're going to just talk about Erasmus for World II. Erasmus was a satirical writer, and satire means that you do sarcastic things. And humanism was his main focus, human potential, what man is capable of, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Erasmus wrote many, many, many different satires, and almost all of them were directed at public figures, and it could be anybody from a philosopher to a cardinal in the church. And basically he would tell people about their downfalls. One of his most famous works was called The Praise of Folly. And you can see here it was written in 1509. And Erasmus basically went through every layer of society that you can possibly think of, even the merchants and the peasants, and just literally tore them apart and made them face what they acted like and how they treated other people, and it's hilariously funny if you understand the content of it. But it was so funny that he wasn't punished for it, even though he wrote about even the king. He wrote bad things about everybody, and it really wasn't bad things, it was true things. But sometimes things that people just don't want to face about themselves. But he was so funny that he was allowed to get away with it. The printing press is something that is going to change the world, and the Renaissance is going to spur a demand for books, for knowledge, for new ideas. People are really going to gain knowledge in leaps and bounds in this time period. So who came up with the idea of the printing press? It was a man by the name of Johann Gutenberg. So Gutenberg's printing press was actually kind of a stolen idea. He stole it from the Chinese. They invented the very first printing press, but it wasn't very user-friendly, and it still took a very long time to print a book. So he took the idea and kind of reworked it. He took a lot of common words and put them in a plate. So it used to be that you had to put every single teeny tiny letter to spell out every single solitary word in this plate. And then you covered it in ink, and then you laid a paper on top of it, and you rolled on top of it, and the words ended up on the paper. It's this very, very long process. But he decided to take common words like the, T-H-E, and make that a solid plate. So now instead of 3 letters, you only have to do 1 little plate. So he changed the way that you actually set up the design to have it printed, and it was a huge success. And the printing press itself just completely changes European society. So it produces hundreds and hundreds of duplicate copies of books. So suddenly the books were very cheap, and people could actually afford them. And because of that, the literacy rates increased, and people began to read. One of the first things that was the first thing that he pulled off the printing press was the Bible. And he called it Gutenberg's Bible. And he actually had it printed not just in English, but also in French and German. And so people who were beginning to read were reading the Bible and realized that a lot of the things the churches had been saying to them was not true. These church leaders had been interpreting the Bible in their own words and way, and basically lying to the peasants to turn things around so that the people would follow what the church said and the church rules. One of the complaints that the church tried to issue was that Bibles up until this point were very, very decorative, and they were all hand drawn, usually by monks, and they were beautiful and a sentimental heirloom kind of thing. And they said, the printing press is going to make it lose that beauty, blah blah blah. But no, the page that I have here on the screen is actually one from the Gutenberg Bible. He figured out how to do it with color and artwork, so it's not just the words. So he proved them wrong on every account. So we have the word out there, what the Bible really said, and it really gets people to start doubting the church. And because of that, it's going to lead to a change in the church called the Reformation. They're going to reform the Catholic Church. So by 1500, there are some serious problems in the Catholic Church, and it had become very corrupt. So some of the problems, I'm going to give you 3. Make sure you know all of them. The first one is that the German and English nobility really resented the church's domination because the church base was in Italy, and they had to send money, a tithe, constantly to Rome. And they didn't like the fact that it was the Italians not only dominating the church and what was said in the church, but the Italians were also making all the money off of everybody else and getting very, very, very rich. So it was the German and the English people that first started to really say, hey, something's not right with this. Why is Rome and Italy getting rich off of a tithe to the church, and other people are actually getting poorer because we have to give so much money to Italy? So that's the first one. The second one is something called usury. It's spelled U-S-U-R-Y. And usury simply is loans with a very, very heavy interest. In earlier times, when trade really increased after the Crusades, banks had been developed for the very first time. And if you wanted a loan, suddenly you could go to the bank. You didn't have to go to the church, which was the norm before that. And the banks, of course, to make money, had to charge interest. That's just the way that banks work. They still do. And at one point, the church said that that was sinful. And if you took money from a bank and you paid interest, then you were sinning as well, and suddenly everybody's going to hell. But now the church is actually charging usury. They had to compete with the banks, and they did. So that's the second reason, usury. The third one is probably the one that's hardest to believe. It was called the selling of indulgences. And an indulgence basically was a little piece of metal that almost looked like a coin, and you went to the church and you actually bought these, and basically each one that you bought represented a sin. So you could go to the church and buy a fistful of these little indulgence coins, and you could commit as many sins as the coins you had in your hand, and then you were still free and clear to go to heaven. So if you decide you want to go out on a Friday night and get drunk and sleep with 10 people that you shouldn't sleep with, and hit somebody over the head with a bottle and do all these bad things, as long as you still have one of those indulgences in your pocket, you're still good to go, because you're still going to heaven. And this was a really hard thing for a lot of people to believe in, because for one thing, the poor are not out there buying indulgences. It's all the rich people. So now you have a division between the rich and the poor because of the selling of indulgences as well. So it's not just religiously a religious discontent. It's also a social discontent. So the first man that's really going to raise his hand and say, "What the heck are you doing?" was a German man by the name of Martin Luther, and he wrote something called the 95 Thesis. Now, the 95 Thesis is an actual piece of paper with 95 things that he thought the church was doing wrong. That's why it's called the 95 Thesis. Now, legend tells us that on Halloween Day, All Hallows Eve, people went to church because they thought that was the day that the demons, or evil spirits or whatever would come after the innocents. So that was a big church day, believe it or not, during this time period. So he knew that people would be in church, and he went to the door of the church on October 31st and nailed the thesis to the church door in a town in Germany, and scared the crap out of everybody. And it got their attention, and of course they all ran out to see what it said. Now, Luther had some very specific teachings as well in his 95 Thesis. One of them was that people could find salvation by faith alone. All you have to do is believe in God, and your soul is saved. The second one is that all church teachings should be based on the Bible, really what the Bible says, not the lies doled out by the church leaders. The third one was that all people of faith are equal in the eyes of God. So that means they should all be treated equally and not treated badly based on how much money they had. So Luther's teachings really give birth to Protestantism, and as a result, the princes in Germany converted to Protestantism. Remember, they're the one of the groups that hated the Italians for taking all their money, and it ended the authority of the Pope in Germany. So this was a really, really big deal. It also led to conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, which is going to end up resulting in some pretty bad wars, like the 30 Years' War, and other things. So his teachings really sent a ripple through all of Europe, but it was the start of change, and they needed some change. So who influenced Martin Luther? He didn't do it all by himself. He did have a couple of predecessors, and we're going to talk about both of them. Both of them are named John. If you look up John Huss, his name is spelled a million different ways. Some of them are very odd. So I gave you the most easily understood English version of his name, John Huss. He was a priest, and he spoke against Pope John the 23rd because he was making a profit for himself and the king using those evil indulgences. So Huss was brought to court for it, and he was asked to recant or say, I'm sorry, the Pope isn't evil. And instead he said, I appeal to Jesus Christ, the only judge who is almighty and completely just. So he was taken back to his cell. Then on July 6, 1415, he was taken to the cathedral dressed in his priestly garments, and in front of everyone he was stripped of those garments one by one. He refused one last chance to recant as they were tying him to the stake, and he still refused to. Instead of recanting, he said a prayer, and his prayer was, Lord Jesus, it is for thee that I patiently endure this cruel death. I pray thee to have mercy on my enemies. So they're expecting him to beg for his life, and he doesn't do it. So they burn him at the stake. They burn him to a crisp. And when they're done, his executioners scoop up his ashes and toss them into the lake so that nothing would remain of the heretic. And they really thought that with his death and the disappearance of his body, there's not even a grave for anybody to go to pay witness to John Huss and what he believed in. They really thought that his ideas and thoughts would just die away, but that's not what happened. The second John was John Wycliffe, and John Wycliffe was one of the first to speak out about the evils of selling indulgences. He was one of the first to advocate for an English translation of the Bible, and he actually wrote one himself before the printing press came along. And so you know how long that, imagine writing the Bible by hand, but this guy did. His later writings, he actually called the Pope an Antichrist. So you can imagine how much trouble he was in. But they didn't get him in time, so they didn't get to kill him and burn him at the stake as a heretic. He actually died of a stroke in 1384. He had lots and lots and lots of followers, and they tried to keep his ideas alive. So in order to crush the movement, in 1428, now almost 50 years later, the church had all his writings burned, and they had his body exhumed, and they burned that publicly. And he was officially declared a heretic of the Catholic Church, and he, just like John Huss, his ashes were scattered in the lake so that no one could ever go back and pay homage to him again. And again, they thought that John Wycliffe's memory would die away, but they were wrong. Martin Luther used the ideas of both Huss and Wycliffe and included them in his 95 Theses. Alright, so let's talk about who is actually still on the side of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church still had some very, very, very powerful people on their side. And the biggest, most powerful group was the Habsburg family. So the Habsburg family, this is the family from which every Holy Roman Emperor was elected between the years of 1438 and 1740. So that is a long time period, and the authority of the Holy Roman Empire himself continued to support the Catholic Church. So you have a lot of people that are very, very powerful that will do anything to keep the Catholic Church alive. And the only reason I put this chart up here, you don't have to know any of the names on it or anything. The reason I put it up there is because it has some of the countries' names on it. And some of the people you would recognize their country, like Ferdinand and Isabella are from Spain. You've got several from Spain. You've got some up here from Bohemia. They're all over the place. So at one time or another through history, this family has ruled over the kingdoms. There's tons of them, but some of them you might recognize as Croatia, Slovenia, Transylvania, Spain, Austria, Milan even, Naples, Serbia, Poland, the Ukraine, Bosnia. They've ruled over all these different places. So very, very powerful people. So it's not like the Protestant religion suddenly became the religion overnight and nobody was Catholic anymore. You still had a huge, huge portion of Europe that is going to remain Catholic because the Habsburg family's pushing it in all of their kingdoms. Now, Germany wasn't the only place that was pushing for change, though. We're going to look at France a little bit. John Calvin is the guy that we're going to look at in France, and he took the ideas that he had heard about from Martin Luther, and he expanded that Protestant movement in his own country. And the things that he taught, he was different than the others before him, because he didn't teach faith alone like Martin Luther did. He preached something called predestination, and he said that upon your birth it was already decided if you were going to go to heaven or hell. It was already predestined, and there was nothing that you could do to change it. But he also said that faith revealed by working hard and living a righteous life, or in other words, your work ethic, showed the world where you were going. If you had a very highly moral work ethic, that was a sign to the world that you were going to go to heaven. And if you were a lazy bum that, didn't complete your honey-do list, then you were going to go to hell. So it wasn't like you didn't know who was going to go to heaven, who was going to go to hell. You knew by people's work ethic. So France is where he ends up doing this. And his followers, their religion is Calvinism. You've probably heard of that. It is a branch of the Protestant religion, so they're Calvinist. But in France, they were called Huguenots. So make sure you remember that, because you're going to have to know the term Huguenots later. So they are Protestant, but they are a different branch of it. So they're Calvinists. They believe in predestination rather than going to heaven through faith alone. So they are a separate group of people than the Lutherans are. That's the difference between those two religions, if you ever wondered. I know you lay in bed at night and wonder about those things, so I thought I'd solve that for you. All right, let's look at England. Henry VIII wanted an annulment from his wife, Catherine. He had been married to her for 20-some years, and she had always had a really hard time getting pregnant, and when she did get pregnant, she lost the children. She only ended up having one child that survived out of countless pregnancies, but it was a daughter. And we think that from diary entries, it kind of seems to indicate that Catherine was going through menopause, and they both realized that she was not going to be able to have any more children. So he wanted to have his marriage annulled. He wanted a son to take the throne when he passed on. And of course, divorce was completely forbidden in the Catholic Church. But Henry VIII, thinking I'm the king, so the Pope can change things for me, went to the Pope, and Pope Clement said, no, sorry, but you're not getting a divorce. And Henry, being the man that he was, and he was a stubborn man, Henry decided he was going to end the Pope's power in England, and he would be the head of the Church of England. Now, today, it's called the Anglican Church. So it's a Protestant version as well, only they're the Anglican branch. So Henry basically did that just to get a divorce. He wasn't a devoutly religious man. He didn't really care if anybody was Catholic or Protestant. He just wanted a divorce, and he wanted to break the power of the Roman Church in England, and he did it. So he officially became the head of the Anglican Church. Now let's look at Queen Elizabeth. His daughter Mary, the daughter that he had with Catherine, was super Catholic. She hated it that her father had done this. And anybody in her kingdom, she's going to rule England for a little while, and anybody who is Catholic is burned at the, or not Catholic, sorry, anybody who's not Catholic is basically burned at the stake as a witch. So she forced people to say that they were not Protestant, or they would die. So she actually died of stomach cancer, and her baby sister, Queen Elizabeth, is going to take the throne. She's the longest ruling female up until this point. She's actually going to rule for 44 years, and the Anglican Church is going to actually it's going to be brought back under Elizabeth. And it becomes the national church throughout the British Isles under Elizabeth. She actually makes it official, that this is our country's official religion. but she was tolerant. She didn't really care if you were Catholic. She just preferred to be Protestant, and so she made it the legal church of the British Isles. Nobody died if they were Catholic. She didn't really care. She just preferred to be Protestant and to attend the Anglican Church. So she further spread the Protestant movement like the others did that we just talked about, but she was very, very tolerant, and nobody's getting burned at the stake with her. Now, because of the religion thing, there's going to be a couple other things that come out of it, kind of accidental things. Elizabeth being Protestant, she was kind of an enemy of some of the surrounding Catholic countries. And her sister Mary, who of course has passed away, was once married to Philip II of Spain, who was very, very, very Catholic. And he was Catholic, and he believed in Catholicism, but he also thought that Elizabeth was a cutie pie, and he had been trying to get with her for a very long time, even before Mary's death. And Elizabeth kept pushing him away and pushing him away. Well, when Mary died and she took control of England, he tried to get her to marry him. And he used to call her Good Queen Bess, and that nickname kind of stuck. A lot of people called her Good Queen Bess after that. But she wouldn't marry him. So he used the fact that she was Protestant and went back home to Spain and convinced the people of Spain that they should invade England because England is evil Protestants and they needed to be destroyed. So Philip decides that he's going to invade England. And Elizabeth has no choice but to order her people to attack. She didn't have a whole lot of faith in her navy at the time. The naval people had been asking her for a very long time about exploration. Can we do this? Can we travel across the world? Can we chart new paths? And she had kept saying no. She didn't have a lot of faith in the Navy, but she knew that Philip was coming, so she had nobody else to send but her Navy. So she sends her Navy after the Spanish Armada, which was like the killer naval people of the day. You didn't mess with the Armada because it meant certain death pretty much. But as the Spanish were rounding the northern tip, they were going to come around the northern tip and go between Ireland and England and land there in kind of a surprise attack. This huge storm came up, and it bashed about half of the Armada, smashed them into the shore. A lot of them actually ended up in Ireland. A lot of the Spanish, and some of them never went home. That's a whole nother story. But it destroyed a lot of the Armada, and it gave an upper hand to the English people. So the English actually beat the Spanish Armada, and their victory against, the most powerful naval group on the planet renewed the English faith, and colonization became the new passion of the day. So because of that, she's going to start sending people out to start colonizing all over the world, and they're going to take the idea of the Protestant faith with them. So it's still religion, it's still a religious topic, but beating the Spanish Armada, which all started over religion, is actually going to end up spreading the Protestant faith. So Philip had no idea what he was doing. All right, now the Catholics aren't going to just sit back. They have to do something. They realize that this Protestant religion is spreading like wildfire, and they're kind of afraid of it. So they're going to have their own counter-reformation. You got to make a counter move. And so with the success of the Protestant Reformation, you kind of don't have any choice. So they did several things. They created something called the Council of Trent. And what it was an inquisition of church officials to get them to agree on certain reforms. So they brought all church officials from the Catholic Church, every single one of them, to this council meeting, one at a time, and they would, tell them, these are the new rules that we're going to live by. You're going to get rid of the indulgences, things like that. Are you willing to do all these changes? And if the person said no, they were burned at the stake. So it is an inquisition created by the church, and that was the sentence. If you said no, sentence, death by burning, and the end of that. So pretty violent Reformation here. They also created a group of people called the Society of Jesus. You may know them by Jesuits. And the Jesuits were supposed to go out into the world and spread the word of the new Catholicism to try and help bring Catholics back home in their eyes, bring them back to the faith. So they're a group of kind of missionary type things. Now, in France, a deal was made for the French living there that the Huguenots would be granted religious freedom. And the church kind of insisted on that to stop the wars, allow the Huguenots to practice their Calvinist beliefs, and it was done through the Treaty of Nantes. Now remember that, because that's going to be important in later lessons as well. So the Treaty of Nantes is a goodwill gesture, is going to be a legal document that gives the Huguenots freedom of religion, so they're allowed to be Calvinist in the country of France. And that is the end of the kind of introductory unit. Some of it you've heard before, some of it you have not, and I will see you in Unit 2.